This is Dr. Chad Suma, speaking for KAPOL and Contact Mission, coming to you from the campus of Central Christian College of the Bible in Moberly, Missouri. One of the key questions that often arises in the book of Exodus is the question of when, or even if, the exodus of Israel from Egypt occurred. This is a broad topic, and only an introduction to the major views is possible in this video. And I encourage you to research the question of the dating of the Exodus further. There are some who doubt an Exodus took place, mostly due to some difficulties with the archaeological records of the conquest, which is obviously tied to the Exodus. However, for those who believe in an Exodus from Egypt, dates everywhere from the 17th century BC all the way down to the 12th century have been suggested. That being said, there are two primary dates proposed for the Exodus. The early date theory places the Exodus approximately in the year 1446 BC, during the 18th dynasty of Egypt, in the New Kingdom period, with the pharaoh of the Exodus being either Thutmose III or perhaps Amenhotep II. The late date theory places the Exodus during the early decades of the 13th century, with Ramses II of the 19th dynasty on the throne in Egypt. Let's look for a brief moment at each of these theories. The rather specific date for the early Exodus theory comes from a literal understanding of the biblical text of 1 Kings 6:1, which states that Solomon began building the temple in the 4th year of his reign, which is figured to be around the year 966. That date is figured by comparison to Assyrian records, using their mentioning of a solar eclipse that happened in 763 as a benchmark to calculate other dates from. 1 Kings 6:1 also mentions that this occurred 480 years after the Exodus from Egypt, which would make the Exodus occur in 1446 BC. Another piece of evidence is a reference in Judges 11:26 from the judge Jephthah, who tells the Ammonite king that Israel had been living in the land 300 years. Jephthah was a later judge, dated roughly 1100 BC. Adding 300 years and another 40 for the wilderness wandering period gets a date of 1440 BC, which is close to this early date Exodus. Another piece of evidence that might point to an early Exodus are the Amarna letters written by Canaanite kings to the Egyptian pharaohs Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV, or Akhenaten, about 1380 BC. In these letters, the Canaanite kings are complaining of a group of people called the Hapiru, which some have equated with the term Hebrew. In fairness, the term Hapiru could refer to any stateless individual, but the Israelites of Joshua's day would likely have been identified as Hapiru. Another key artifact that places a recognized people group called Israel in the Promised Land is the Merneptah stele. This stone inscription by the 19th dynasty Pharaoh Merneptah, who was Ramses II's son, mentions a military campaign by the pharaoh into Canaan and lists various people groups he fought. One line in Merneptah's stele states, "Israel, his seed is not." This artifact is dated to about 1210 BC. Speaking of conquest, it has already been noted that the Exodus event and the Israelite conquest of Canaan are linked events. Is there evidence to suggest a conquest 40 years, which is the time of the wilderness wandering, after this early date Exodus? The three main sites mentioned in the book of Joshua that are specifically mentioned as being burned, which in an archaeological site is manifested by a big ash layer, are Jericho, Hatzor, and Ai. While Ai has not been yet conclusively identified, there are archaeologists who would argue that both Hatzor and Jericho were destroyed about 1400 BC. These archaeological sites are very contested, but Dr. Bryant Wood has found seal impressions of Pharaoh Amenhotep II at Jericho, who would have been on the Egyptian throne about 1400 BC, but there are no remains at Jericho after that until about the 800s BC. So there is much to suggest the date of 1446 as a likely candidate for the date of the Exodus. The late date Exodus is based on the reading of Exodus 1:11, in which we are informed that the Israelite slaves built storage cities for Pharaoh, namely Pithom and Pi-Ramses. The origin of the late date of approximately 1275 BC is due to the fact that this would have placed Ramses II on the throne in Egypt, and that the storage city was named after the pharaoh. It is this view that Hollywood has popularized in classic films like The Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille, who made the movie twice, and more modern films like The Prince of Egypt. While the site of Pithom is a matter of debate, the site of Pi-Ramses is likely Tel el-Dava, which was only occupied for a brief period during the 19th dynasty, and too late to have been built before the time period of the early date Exodus. But it does fit better with this late date Exodus. However, the nearby location of Avaris, which did exist in the 15th century BC, was a large city full of Asiatics, non-Egyptians, which could be identified with the Israelites. though some suggest that only the Asiatic Hyksos were present there. It is suggested that the later biblical writers changed Avaris to P. Ramses, which was better known, so that the reader might understand better the location. We do know that the biblical writers switched the ancient name for Dan, Laish, with the later Dan, and so there is precedent for this. What about support from the biblical text for this late date view? Biblical support is harder here, but some have suggested that the aforementioned 1 Kings 6:1 could be used to support the late date. The 480 years of 1 Kings 6:1 is simply 12 times 40, or a generation. However, this number is thought to be symbolic by some, with a generation being more like 25 years. 12 times 25 is 300, which added to 966 brings the date to 1266 BC, which comes in line with this early date. One difficulty with this view is that it struggles with Judges 11:26, which in this view typically requires either a severe overestimation by the judge Jephthah of Israel's time in the land, or simply that Jephthah was mistaken. Advocates for the late date theory often point to various destructions in the land of Canaan toward the end of the 13th century. These seem to be very widespread and do make decent support for the theory, but the late date theory also does struggle with the archaeological remains of various sites, in particular the site of Jericho. However, it is possible that the destruction found in the land of Canaan at this time are not due to the Israelites, but due to the Egyptian campaigns of the 19th dynasty, of which Merneptah Stele is a record of one. There is certainly much more that could be talked about with this topic. Some, following Dr. David Roll's suggestion that the Egyptian chronology is in error, would place an Exodus even toward the beginning of the 16th century. On the other extreme, there are those who advocate for a 12th century Exodus, based on the rates of Israelite settlement in the hill country of Canaan. There are also controversial artifacts, like the Berlin pedestal, that might mention the term Israel and could be dated to the mid-1300s BC. In conclusion, the dating of the Exodus is a complicated topic, with lots of data to try and fit into one's personal theory. Much of the difficulty lies with the archaeological record. But it should be remembered that archaeology gives an incomplete picture, and it may be that in the years to come, more conclusive evidence will be found that will hopefully clarify the question of when was the Exodus. But regardless of what line of interpretation one takes, all of this evidence seems to support the veracity of the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt as an actual historical event. And to deny such likely resembles an anti-biblical bias, more so than reasoned induction from the evidence. Again, I'm Dr. Chad Suma with KAPOL and Contact Mission.